We're opening this concert with a little-known work of Beethoven, and perhaps there might be some, as there frequently is, why did you pick that particular work? It's a little piece, it's about 4 minutes long. It's a march for winds, brass, and percussion called Zapfenstreich. I know my German is terrible. And apparently this was just a little march that was played to summon troops back to their barracks. It's Beethoven in his most informal, cheerful mood. Etc. Yes, of course, it makes a lovely curtain opener because it's bright and festive, but I had two things in mind when I programmed it. One is that because the next work on the concert is the Benjamin Britten Violin Concerto, and that's going to, of course, draw a lot of focus to the violin, I wanted to sort of put the winds and brass and percussion in the spotlight for just a moment before we focused so keenly on a stringed instrument. But more to the point, and for more dramatic reasons, this is really the only happy march on the concert. Now, for those of you who know Tchaikovsky's Pathétique, at least heard it a few times, you may have had a red flag go off in your head and you're thinking, what do you mean the only happy march? What about... More about that a little bit later. Benjamin Britten's Violin Concerto is a beautiful work, stunning work. The more people that I meet who know it, all of us cannot understand why it is not better known. I think of it in terms of its power and its lyricism as a sort of a British counterpart to Samuel Barber's much more famous violin concerto. But the Britten is beginning to get a foothold in the repertoire. More and more violinists are playing it. It is showing up on more concerts here in the States, I'm happy to say. We have a wonderful soloist for this concert, Emma McGrath, who loves it quite as dearly as I do. And interesting that it starts out with a ghostly hint of a march. It starts out with just timpani and cymbals, and of course there's only so much I can do on the piano to make it sound like a cymbal clash, so you're going to have to use your imagination, pretend that that's cymbals. So it starts out with just this distant rat-a-tat of timpani and cymbals. You know, is it military? My guess is that, yes, it does have something to do with the military because Britten, as is well known, was an ardent pacifist and eventually a conscientious objector. And apparently this concerto, he put into this concerto a lot of his passions, concerns about the Spanish Civil War. And in fact, I believe he informally intended it as a requiem to all of those who fell in the Spanish Civil War. The first entry of the violin after a couple of bars of orchestral tissue by the strings, the harp and the woodwinds, is so drop-dead gorgeous. Etc. I mean, it is so poignant and so incredibly beautiful. It goes from there into a faster section, a somewhat more militaristic section. There is then a demonic scherzo. It in some ways predates the scherzo from the Shostakovich first violin concerto that the Philharmonic performed just a few seasons ago. And then, against type, a very broad finale based on a Passacaglia tune of Britten's own devising. The piece ends in a vein of hushed tragedy, and that made it a perfect companion piece to the piece that's going to take up the second half of our concert, Tchaikovsky's Pathétique Symphony. Tchaikovsky was notoriously self-critical. He didn't think very much of Swan Lake. He referred to it quite plainly as trash. Didn't like his Fifth Symphony, didn't like the Nutcracker, dismissed the 1812 Overture as that very noisy piece I wrote. I mean, he was pretty cruel to a lot of his music. At least those survived. There were a lot of pieces that he simply destroyed if he felt that they weren't worthy of him. The Pathétique, however, he really seems to have had a genuine fondness for. He really seems to know that he was onto something major. He called it the best of my works. And it is almost impossible to look at this piece outside the context of its being his last big work and the fact that its world premiere took place 9 days before his own death at the ridiculously young age of 53. Leonard Bernstein, in a lecture on the piece, famously called attention to the fact that there are so many scales in it. I mean, there are a lot of scales in a lot of Tchaikovsky's works, but for some reason Bernstein felt that in this piece they were that much more prominent. And in studying it, I discovered that certainly that is the case, but the fact that the descending scales, I believe, outnumber the ascending ones, and further that every movement in some way, shape, or form ends with a descending scale, really drags you down at the end of each movement, like a little bit further. Even if the music is in a major key, I'm thinking of the end of the first movement where the strings have just over which the brass is playing. Echoed by the woodwinds. So there's that sense of all these gestures just leading you downward, downward, downward. At the end of the second movement, probably the first major piece of music to be written in 5 beats to the bar, and mind you, this is a long time before, etc. At the end of that movement, the winds do a series of descents. Brass. So again, we're pulled down, pulled down. And then the march, the way I described it to the Philharmonic, we have a wonderful marriage, this orchestra and me, and I can share with them some of my innermost thoughts about music and not feel that I'm overstepping some boundary in terms of, well, some orchestras just want you to tell them, do you want it loud or soft? The Philharmonic is not that way. We share a lot of intense information. And the way I described the march to them, at least in my take on it, is, have you ever embarked on something major, whether it was a love affair, a new job, and even though you were giving it your all, somewhere in the depths of you, in the pit of your stomach, you knew it was doomed to failure. You knew it, and yet you pursued it, and you gave it your all, knowing it was not going to work out. That, to me, is what the march is. It keeps running around in circles. I know a lot of people find Tchaikovsky overly repetitive. I personally do not. And yet in this march, there's so much almost needless repetition. It's like energy without something behind it. I do not think it was his inspiration run dry. I think the banality, the energy without the belief is absolutely deliberate. The march is a magnificent bit of trying to convince himself of the validity of something when he knows, in fact, that it is not to be. The ending of the march, which always draws applause no matter what you do, ends with again, a series of descending scales. Which have dragged us down to this point, and then there's nothing to do but just belch out a bunch of G major chords. Now, I was playing it in exactly the register he wrote it in. Here he's got this grand orchestra that he can potentially use to make a big, grand gesture at the end. And yet, the very end of the march, it's clarinets, bassoons, horns, trombones, strings, and timpani. So there's only so much color you can get from that low, almost turgid series of voices. It is not a very happy ending. Even the ending of the Fifth Symphony, which was here, he at least had the trumpets. And because of the brightness of the key of E major and the use of the trumpets here, it still felt forceful and committed. But this just doesn't quite make it. Setting the stage for an absolutely revolutionary finale. Not the big, requisite, romantic symphony, grand finale where all obstacles to happiness have been vanquished, but an admission that these obstacles have taken over and have won. The Seattle Philharmonic, like some other American orchestras and many orchestras still in Europe, we seat our violins, the firsts to my left, the seconds to my right. This was, in fact, and I make a point of stressing this whenever I can, this was the way that orchestras sat for centuries. They certainly sat that way in Tchaikovsky's time. And there are several major works in the repertoire by Tchaikovsky and other composers that I feel are absolutely dependent on this setup to be effective. Now, we all know that the opening of the finale of Tchaikovsky's Pathétique is this heartrending cry out of the violins. Now, when all the violins are sitting together, firsts and seconds, one would think, logically, because all the strings are playing, that the first violins have this tune, and that the second violins would have the next voice down in the chain. Well, in fact, what happens is that he alternates notes between the two sections, having one on top and one under it, crisscross, crisscross, crisscross. If you listen to the two violins' parts, one at a time, the first violins sound like this. And the second violins sound like this. Now, when they're both playing at the same time, you get. But when you're outside of it, and that tune is ripping its guts out left to right, da, dee, da, 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 it is 10 times more emotionally wrenching than if all the violins are sitting together and one just assumes it's all coming out of the first. He is absolutely ripping himself wide open for everybody to hear. And the ending of this symphony, again, he's taking this one tune which essentially descends in a series of broken up scales. And eventually that heartbeat in the contrabasses just gets less and less active, and the symphony quite literally dies a miserable death, a beautiful, miserable death. And we are honored to be in the service of this beautiful, miserable death. Better a great piece of art with a depressing message than a piece of trash that leaves you feeling good.